Hello and welcome to this screencast. This is screencast for lecture number 5 on happiness. So in this lecture we're talking about the obsession with happiness, and we start off doing that by looking at a long-standing idea that if you're happy then that is going to have a positive effect on business. Something like this.
The research has shown that every single business outcome is actually predicted by our level of positivity.
He's not entirely sure which research he's quoting there. Anyway, the idea of happiness at all entering into organization is in a way starting in the industrial betterment movement. This is during the late 19th century, where it was a lot of concern with the conditions in industries. The really big boom for happiness is in the human relations movement, where the idea of trying to treat a human as an emotional being rather than as a robot was in the vogue. And from that point, it's been an ambition to try and find a relationship between happiness, or if you like, job satisfaction on the one hand, and productivity on the other. And in the early studies, often what they did was to look at how people felt, happy or not, and then work out whether that would make them productive. A later set of research, mainly in the 1970s, would look at it the other way around. If you are a productive worker doing well at your job, well, maybe then that is going to be the cause for why you are happy. Anyway, what I wanted to do here is to confront and challenge some of these assumptions. So, if you think about people working in maquiladoras, a sweatshop in China, do you think they're going to be more productive if they're happy? If you're a slave, are happy slaves going to be more productive than unhappy slaves? So in a way, what I want to do here is to look at some of the limitation of context. It is an interesting study that was made in this regard by Rian Silvestro, where she looked at the four big supermarkets in the UK, and her result was that the more unhappy the workers, the less satisfied they were, the better the store profit margins. Now, shouldn't be taken as a proof that the opposite relationship exists, but it does problematize and puts into question this long-standing assumption. So going from that assumption, we're moving on to look at positive psychology. And we're starting off looking at Martin Seligman. There's a video on Martin Seligman on the blog. He was the president of the American Psychological Association. He became that in 1998, and that was really the time when positive psychology started to kick off. His most famous book is Authentic Happiness, which, to cut a long story short, is about finding authentic happiness that is sustainable and that you can live your life. So it's not about eating chocolate and watching television, but rather about going to the museum and spending quality time with family and friends. Now, Seligman is really, if you like, the face of positive psychology. And I wanted to quickly summarize positive psychology. One thing is that you really want to concentrate on what's positive. Traditionally, psychology has often looked at negative things. Freud, for example, would look a lot on sexual perversions, been a lot of psychology done on why people would behave in evil ways, etc., etc. So Seligman wanted to look at the positive side rather than the negative side. And the other key thing is that for him, this is a personal pursuit, and you shouldn't settle with the bare minimum. He says, I think at one point, you shouldn't go, I don't want to go from -7 to +2, I want to go from -7 to +50. So it's about not being content with just being content. You could do more. That, in a way, is, in a nutshell, what he is trying to argue. Another key thing is that happiness and well-being is not something that's going to be brought to you by external circumstances. It's not going to be brought to you by other people. It's mainly your own business. It's up to you to do to shape your life in such a way that you will become happy. And the fourth one is what I call a rather liberal idea or liberal view of science. They would draw on a lot of they would use a lot of scientific vocabulary, but it is, if you like, questionable whether they really do have proof for what they're saying. Anyway, Seligman is an extremely influential person, and in fact, he was the person influencing influencing David Cameron.
He's already inspired David Cameron to announce last year that there'll be a move to try to measure our gross national happiness.
So, the first happiness survey, UK happiness survey, was made in 2011. And the whole idea with measuring a nation's well-being is that it would say more about how a country is really doing than just looking at GDP. So in the survey, what they found was that you're likely to be more happy if you live in Scotland or Northern Ireland as opposed to Wales or England. You're supposed to be more happy if you're a teenager or a retired person rather than a middle-aged person. And you are more likely to be happy if you live in rural areas as opposed to former industrial. So you can look at living in Cardiff here, which is in Wales. Most of us are probably not teenagers or retired people, and we do live in a former industrial city. Now, this is how the actual survey looked like. 4 questions. First one asked, overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? The average score on in the UK was 75.9. Second question, overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? An average of 80. Overall, how happy did you feel yesterday? An average of 71.1. And finally, overall, how anxious did you feel yesterday? When you did this test in class, you turned out to be slightly less happy than the average in the UK, but slightly less anxious as well. Now, can you really measure happiness? And we're looking here at 3 different examples. The first is just basically rating your own mood.
Ask you to rate your mood on a 9-point rating scale. So the first rating would be on positive affect.
About a 4. 4 would be.
And this is again from a documentary that will be linked to in the blog. It's all on YouTube. And the second is basically filling in questionnaires, and the final one is by a scientific method, which is basically about measuring different forms of brain activity. You can see more of that in that documentary. And I asked you which of these 3 methods you would find more credible, and you were the vast majority went for number 3, the scientific way. And this led us to trying to identify some problems with happiness. And starting off with that is to look at how happiness is a very long-standing issue. Saint Augustine could identify, this is around the early 400 AD, he could identify 259 distinctly different accounts of what happiness means. In the 18th century alone, you had 50 treatises, 50 big books dealing with the subject of happiness, each of which would come up with its own distinct idea of what happiness means and how we could pursue it.